Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Thera Edwards, and I'm a member of staff in the Department of Geography and Geology at the University of the West Indies Mona campus in the Faculty of Science and Technology. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's event in the Science for Today series of fora. Today's event, Ash in the Air, Eruption in Effect, La Soufrière St. Vincent 2020-21, is hosted by the Department of Geography and Geology in collaboration with the UWI Seismic Research Center. The Faculty of Science and Technology aims to be the to-go place for science, knowledge, research, and solutions. With this strategic vision in mind, the Science for Today Forum series was launched in September 2018. Through this initiative, the Faculty of Science and Technology brings together academics and professionals from the private and public sector to contribute to the science discourse regarding topical issues that affect our society while highlighting the relevance of all disciplines of science in our everyday happenings and lives. To date, the faculty has hosted some 15 fora in the series. Featured issues have included COVID and the environment, Risk is Opportunity, Ready for the Big One, The Immense Value of Forests, Plastics, the Science Behind the Ban, and Minimizing Mosquito Mayhem. Landslides, Infrastructure, and Housing Construction was the most recent forum hosted by the Department of Geography and Geology in March 2021. The series is free of cost and open to all members of the public. Past recordings can be found on YouTube. La Soufrière, a stratovolcano on the Caribbean island of St. Vincent, began effusively erupting on December 27, 2020, forming a new lava dome, sending volcanologists on high alert based on past eruption events. On April 9, 2021, there was an explosive eruption, with continued explosive eruptions as well as pyroclastic flows over the following days. Evacuation of Vincentians in the vulnerable red zone of the island was put into effect on the recommendation of the volcanologist monitoring La Soufrière when it was evident that the explosive eruption was imminent. Many countries, led by island neighbors in the region, and organizations at the national level such as the National Emergency Management Organization and regional level organizations such as the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency provided relief and support in the wake of the explosive eruptions. In the aftermath of these events, we take a look in today's forum at the before, during, and after of the La Soufrière volcanic eruption with our panel of regional experts, ably moderated by Professor Richard Robertson. Please allow me to introduce this evening's moderator. Professor Richie Robertson is a geologist and volcanologist whose interest in volcanology was inspired by his personal experience during the 1979 eruption of the La Soufrière volcano in St. Vincent. He has a BSc in Geology from UWI and an MPhil in Volcanology from the University of Leeds and a PhD in Geology from the University of the West Indies Mona. He joined the staff of the Seismic Research Center in 1993 after serving for 6 years as head of the Soufrière Monitoring Unit in St. Vincent. He has served several tours of duty as chief scientist of the Montserrat Volcano Observatory and was its director from October 1998 to March 1999. Professor Robertson was appointed head of the Seismic Research Center in July 2008 to August 2011. Then again in October 2012 to October 2019. He has worked in most aspects of the SRC operations, but has been most closely associated with the public education and outreach hazards assessment, and ground deformation. He has a keen interest in the dissemination of scientific information to vulnerable island communities and is an experienced field researcher as well as an academic. I'm sure you will agree with me that Professor Robertson's experience and academic credentials make him well positioned to be this evening's moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Robertson, our moderator for this afternoon's discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Edwards, for quite nicely introducing what we intend to be a most engaging and very interesting session. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers today who will take us through all aspects of the ongoing eruption at La Soufrière. As Dr. Edwards have said, the eruption started late last year and has been ongoing from a effusive to an explosive phase. And today we have a lineup of speakers that include Dr. Uracilla Joseph, the director of the Seismic Research Center, who would look at the management, from the scientific management to some aspects of the crisis management. We have Ms. Michelle Forbes, who is the director of NEMO, the local organization that has had the task of managing the response to this crisis. And then we have Ms. Elizabeth Riley, who is the executive director of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Organization, the agency regionally that has been providing significant support to St. Vincent and Grenadines. And finally, we have Dr. Rose Ann Smith, who has been doing a lot of research, certainly on St. Vincent, on vulnerable communities and hazards and things like that. So we have a lineup of speakers that would allow us to look at all aspects of the eruption. And my job today, really, this afternoon, is really to introduce these speakers. And in doing so, I'd like to start first with Dr. Joseph, who will be looking at the management, monitoring, and impact of the eruption. Dr. Uracilla Joseph, as we call her, Pat at Seismic, is a volcanologist and currently the director of the Seismic Research Center. She's actually been at Seismic and with the university community for the past 17 years. And I'm happy to say that, if anything, she is a homegrown talent, both at Seismic at UWI, because she did a PhD, she did her master's at UWI, and in fact, she helped to establish the geothermal monitoring system that we now use in the region that helps us to monitor volcanoes like La Soufrière. She particularly does research on the analysis and collection of volcanic gases in geothermal areas, which provide potential precursors to eruptions. Dr. Joseph has been the person who has been lead scientist, lead behind us all, pulling us all together in terms of the scientific effort, doing a fantastic job in making sure that we have a team of scientists both within the region and supported externally, who have been looking at the volcano and what it's been doing and providing advice to St. Vincent and Grenadines. So it's my pleasure to turn you over now to Dr. Joseph, who will take us through what has happened and how we have responded. So over to you, Dr. Joseph.
Thank you so much, Prof. Robertson. I really do appreciate that lovely welcome and introduction. So as was mentioned, I will begin by looking at a quick overview on the Seismic Research Center, what we do, and the history of La Soufrière, followed by the monitoring methodology and techniques that we use, as well as a summary of the findings of the different streams of monitoring. Look at our communications, the way in which we rolled out our communication efforts with respect to the eruption, as well as the main impacts and our overall management strategy. So as most people would know by now, the Seismic Research Center is a primary source of information for earthquakes and volcanoes in the English-speaking Eastern Caribbean. We have the largest geophysical network of over 60 stations throughout the region, and we have actually over our 60 plus years of operations, we've dealt with a number of volcano seismic crises throughout the islands in which we operate, with each island showing at least one period of unrest or elevated activity, some, however, experiencing several. And the latest of which, of course, everyone is familiar with is the La Soufrière in St. Vincent. So in addition to that, we provide contributing government with maps and information on geological hazards. We support the disaster management agencies with public education efforts, and we conduct research on the geological processes in the region. In summary, this is a quick little profile view of La Soufrière volcano. It has a height of approximately 1.1 kilometers, diameter at the base of about 12.8 kilometers, and the summit has a diameter of 1.6 kilometers. In terms of its historical activity, we've since 1718, when the first eruption was described at La Soufrière, there's been at least 6 historical eruptions. Some of them have been explosive, and then we've had effusive eruptions at this volcano. So most people would know effusive is actually how this eruption started, with a gentle emission of magma or flow of magma at the surface of the crater, and then it transitioned to an explosive type. So this volcano shows both explosive and effusive type eruptions. In terms of the explosive eruptions, 1718, 1812, 1902, 1979, and of course 2020, 2021. The primary damage in the past has been from the ash, as well as the impacts of the pyroclastic density currents, what we call pyroclastic flow and surges. So most people are also familiar with the timeline of activity of the eruptions and the activity at La Soufrière. It began, as Prof. Robertson mentioned, in in November. We started to see increased earthquake activity associated with the volcano. On December 27th, a new dome emerged in the crater adjacent to the old 1979 dome, and this was detected first by NASA firm's satellite hotspot detection, and then this was followed immediately by us confirming visually that a dome was present, a new dome was growing in the crater, and a raising of the alert level to orange. Then the next step was to get a team on island, of which we had a 3-member team, including Prof. Robertson, getting into St. Vincent to improve the network strengthening there. And then, of course, we had the collection of rocks. We had the continued monitoring of the dome. Then in March, we saw changes in the seismicity associated with the volcano. This increased, and just prior to the eruption, we saw further changes with respect to the type of seismicity that was observed, going from what we call VT, volcanic earthquake, to the volcanic earthquake swarms increased to tremor, and then we had the explosive eruption that began on April the 9th, and then we have the continuous periods of eruption until April the 22nd, and the alert level was reduced to orange on the 6th of May. So in terms of our response, so as I mentioned before, our first thing was to strengthen the monitoring network and conduct hazard and risk assessments, because this would have meant putting a team on island, having to do work at the summit for an extended period of time with a growing dome. Then we worked closely with the National Disaster Coordinator to coordinate these monitoring efforts, participated in both public and virtual town hall meetings, and of course this was essential because we know the volcano is capable of both effusive and explosive type activities, so the public needed to prepare in the event of that transitioning, which did happen. We conducted other essential scientific fieldwork, such as the rock and gas sampling, and we provided regular advisories and briefings to a large number of decision makers. And of course, part of our big communication effort was to respond to media inquiries, develop and implement a social media program, and to provide public awareness on the ongoing activities. So some of the considerations that had to be taken in when we were responding to the eruption was that, of course, we were dealing with an ongoing COVID pandemic, which meant the quarantining of staff, travel restrictions, because our base is located in Trinidad, and that meant we had to apply for, and our borders were closed at the time, and it still is, and we need to continue to navigate that by requesting travel exemptions and ongoing PCR testing and that sort of thing, and rostering of staff. Then, of course, the Seismic Research Center, the way in which we're funded, over the last few years, we've had financial constraints. And this, of course, has an impact on funding for additional monitoring equipment that was needed to strengthen the network rapidly. And this included both seismic, ground affirmation, visual and thermal monitoring equipment, as well as gas monitoring equipment. We, of course, we have a small staff complement, so we had to think carefully of how to manage the response with respect to staff movements and availability of staff, both scientific and technical, which meant we had to utilize the SRC staff based at the Montserrat Volcano Observatory to assist with the response, and of course utilize their expertise as they monitor the Soufrière Hills volcano in Montserrat. Then we've also had to develop new areas of expertise, such as the risk assessment tools and products, the way in which we report scientific data, and E&O tools. Of course, helicopter support was needed, and this is, of course, very costly. And this was essentially needed to deploy equipment at the summit and to move staff in the field, so that, one, because of the amount of equipment and the weight of it to deploy, as well as to help minimize the amount of time staff would spend at the summit doing work in terms of the risk that they were exposed to. We had the possibility of rapid changes in volcanic activity to look at, as well as planning for the unknown length of an eruption. It could have gone on for months to years. In this case, it transitioned within a few months from the effusive to the explosive. And that, of course, meant the financial and human resource needs had to be considered, as well as the possibility of concurrent volcanic unrest in other islands of our responsibility. So just quickly, in terms of strengthening of the network, it involved deploying a seismic network that included 8 seismic stations, 6 continuous GPS stations, doing measurements of what we call EDM, electronic distance measurement, and this was measuring any possible changes in the shape of the flanks. That's the sides of the volcanoes, in case the dome that was growing inside was pressing against the flank and causing flank instability. We used remote sensing satellite data to look at changes in ground affirmation, as well as conduct gas measurements using multi-gas and DOAS equipment at the summit. And we also continually monitored the dome changes using drone as well as satellite imagery, and monitored the changes in the growth rates. So with respect to the data from the different monitoring streams, so in terms of seismicity, this diagram depicts all of the red dots that you see on the top line. Those indicate explosions that happened when the first one happening here on the 9th of April, and then continuing up until the 22nd of April. And in all, 32 explosions occurred, and you can see the change in seismicity of the volcano, with it moving from volcanotectonic earthquakes. That's the one where magma tries to make its way up to the surface, and with the force of that material, it causes cracks beneath the earth. It cracks up the rock to find a pathway, and that breaking of rock causes that type of signal, VT earthquakes. And then when there's a part created, the fluid movement of the gas and the magma, like molten magma, transitions to a low frequency or long period earthquakes. So you see that change here where it moves from the in the second line where we see the recording of the VTs, and then the bottom line shows you transitioning to the type of signal that we call long period earthquakes. So this, in summary, is what we saw with respect to the seismicity. With the dome, as you can see on the diagram on the right, we saw a change in growth from a very cylindrical pattern, then to elongation on both the northern and southern sectors to form what we call a coulée. And the tracking of this dome growth was done, as I said before, by using photogrammetry. This is drone footage and the photographs and videos taken from that, as well as a combination of satellite imagery. This dome, what we call the 2020-2021 dome, was destroyed along with the 1917-9 dome during the explosive phase of the eruption. In terms of ground deformation, in the early stages of the eruption, there was very minimal changes in the ground deformation observed by our network. However, with the explosive phase, we saw a rapid displacement of the network, of the continuously monitoring GPS network. And you can see that where it moves from this blue line to what is highlighted in red. And that displacement was consistent of what we call a depressurization of the magma reservoir. So if you think of a balloon that was inflated and then you pop it, that is the deflation signal that was indicated by the red. So that was consistent with the explosion that vented all of the material that was building up and the pressure that was building up beneath the summit. And then this has since slowed down considerably until April the 22nd. And after that, we have a minimal deformation currently being observed. In terms of the gas measurements, of course, this was taken at the summit at the time during the effusive phase. And what happened is we saw a change in the gas signature where the primary sulfur gas in a volcano that is not at unrest is a gas called hydrogen sulfide. When there is unrest and fresh magmatic material coming up beneath the volcano, there is a switch in that gas composition, and the primary sulfur gas switches to what we call sulfur dioxide. And what we saw happening was that while there was this switch observed, it was not, we did not see a pure SO2 signal. It was still a mixture of that hydrothermal signature, which is the H2S, along with the SO2. And then the SO2 only became dominant when the volcano actually exploded, which is what we're measuring now and what people would see in the advisories that we issue weekly. As I mentioned before, we had to develop a number of tools and resources to respond to the media as well as the public and to provide information to a number of different stakeholders. Voice notes, WhatsApp. We used all of the traditional forms of social media and as well as updates on our websites and provision of talks such as the one we're having now, and Instagram photos and virtual seminars, etc. In terms of the impacts, most people would have seen some of these impacts, particularly the ash. And in the early phase of the eruption, when those domes were being destroyed, both the 2020-2021 dome and the 1979 dome, there was a tremendous amount of ash that was generated by those explosions, covering the entire St. Vincent, as you can see on the diagram on the right, with the red, and as well as drifting across to our neighbors, Barbados, even St. Lucia, having some amount of ash deposited. So, of course, the heaviest concentrations were in the north and the area surrounding the volcano, but with lower amounts going down to the south. And the other two major impacts were the pyroclastic density currents that in some cases reach the coastline at Laracay and Walibu. Now, PDCs, as most people would know, by now following all of the outreach that we did with respect to volcanic terms and hazards, PDCs are very fast-moving, hot gas and ash mixtures that flow down the flanks of a volcano and very, very rapidly with very high temperatures. And of course, they can cause fires and they obliterate everything in their path. And these reach the sea, the coastline at Laracay and Walibu. And then after that, with all of the material that's been deposited around the volcano and on the flanks of the volcano, with rainfall, these materials have been incorporated into the rainfall and flow along the flanks of the volcano in the form of lahars or mud flows. And this is an example of one in the Walibu River. So this continues to be a problem long after the actual eruption is over, because with rainfalls, and as people know, we're approaching the hurricane season. We're in the hurricane season. With the increased rainfall during this time, this material can be remobilized for months to come and can cause quite a bit of damage in the valleys in which the flow happens. In terms of our management, by now you've heard a lot about the red zone and the orange zone. These zones have been defined by use of historical data as well as mapping of the deposits from past eruptions. And in terms of the areas that have been damaged intensely from large historical eruptions, and this one in particular was used. The 1902 eruption was used to kind of base the damage assessment with respect to creation of the volcanic hazard map for La Soufrière volcano, with the red zone being the area of the highest hazard. That's the areas of the PDCs and the highest ashfall, etc. Then the orange zone, yellow, and the green zone is the least hazard. In collaboration with the volcanic hazard maps, we use a volcanic alert level table, which corresponds to the colors and then gives an idea of the symptoms related to that alert level, as well as the actions that scientists usually take when the alert level is at a certain color, and then the recommended action that's usually taken by civil authorities. As I mentioned before, the current alert level is orange. One of the other two tools that we use, the Seismic Research Center, as I mentioned before, one of the ways in which we try to support the agencies that we work with and the islands that we work with is we try to raise funding of our own to do certain projects and so on that develop or build resilience. And one of these, which actually Professor Robertson is the primary researcher, the primary investigator, is the Volcano Ready Communities Project. And this project was implemented in November 2018, so prior to the eruption, where it aimed to enhance community-specific disaster responses, familiarize people with the hazard maps, strengthen community knowledge and awareness in the event that there is an explosive eruption of La Soufrière. And this project was actually a very important one to help in terms of people being familiar with a lot of the terms and being able to respond quickly when the evacuation order was given by the government of St. Vincent. In terms of the prognosis going forward, at the moment, seismic activity is low. And since the explosion of the 22nd of April, we're seeing very few long period earthquakes at the moment. However, there's persistent steaming that's visible from the summit area. And when we do get some views based on flights passing over, etc., you can see, and of course the thermal imagery that we get, well, hotspot detection by NASA firms, confirms that there is a lot of hot material still very close to the surface in the crater. And this is right now evident in the steaming vents that are still noticeable or present in the dome, in the crater, sorry. And this is the volcano continues to be in a state of unrest, and there is of course an increased risk of lahars, as I mentioned before, during periods of heavy rainfall. So this is something that we continue to look at, and for the next weeks to months, and we will continue to advise of changes in activity based on the monitoring data that we continue to collect. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share this information with you today.
And thank you very much, Dr. Joseph, for that overview of what has happened during the eruption, for certainly sharing with us some of the challenges that the UAE Seismic Research Center have had, particularly with regard to resources and with regard to the COVID situation, for taking us through some of the monitoring signals that you saw as the eruption developed, some of the impacts, and certainly how you from a scientific group had to manage and work with the authorities to manage the response to the crisis that is still ongoing. Of course, I'm sure that people have lots of questions, and we'll get to them in the Q&A at the end. But now it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Michelle Forbes, who is the National Emergency Management Organization's Director. Ms. Forbes has been with NEMO since December 2004, when she joined as the Deputy Director and becoming the Director in 2017, in May 2017. She's eminently qualified to do the job that she's doing because she holds a Bachelor of Science honors degree in International Disaster Engineering and Management from Coventry University in the United Kingdom. As well as in 2008, she obtained a Fulbright scholarship and went on to complete her master's in public administration, and also has a graduate certificate in disaster management from the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies in Georgia State University, Atlanta, Georgia. Certainly in the context of what she has had to deal with in St. Vincent for the past year, COVID and now the volcanic eruption, she unfortunately joins a small group of people who have had to deal with multiple crises in a small island state. So I'm sure she has lots of experience to share, and therefore, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ms. Forbes, who will speak to us about the eruption impacts, and particularly the response of the civil authorities to the crisis and how they dealt with it and continue to deal with it. So over to you, Ms. Forbes.
Good evening, everyone. Pleasant good evening, and thank you for having us presenting on the La Soufrière eruption 2020-21 and looking at the eruption impact and response of the civil authorities. Just a quick outline, I'll be doing a bit of the pre-eruption planning, looking at the evacuation, how did we respond, and some of the impacts. I know Dr. Joseph would have already mentioned some, and just some quick conclusion as I go through this evening. We have seen this map, and in looking at the whole pre-eruption planning, this is one of the guides that we use to really educate and inform persons and look at our civil responsibility in terms of planning for such an event. Who would have thought we would have had 2 eruptions within a 40 to 45 year period? Certainly not many of us, and we thought that we may only have one in our lifetime. And this map in particular allowed us to really go into the communities and share this information on persons where they were living in relation to the volcano and the hazards that they can expect if there's an eruption. We must note in this particular map, years before when I just joined NEMO, Fancy was in the orange zone, and through advocating with the Seismic Research Center and of course doing some of the social studies and social impact, we thought it best to have from Fancy right down to Georgetown based on the pyroclastic flows and having to move persons in the event of an eruption into the red zone. So this map is really the one that we use to guide us in a lot of the planning. So much so now our persons who have been displaced can tell you whether they're in the red, orange, yellow, or green zone. Now, as part of the pre-eruption planning, it was not an overnight planning. We have been living with this volcano for quite some time. We thought to update this plan in 2014. We tested the plan during the trade winds exercise in 2019, and we looked at revising a lot of the work around the planning for this volcanic emergency with the community, with the Seismic Research Center. When we recognized that we would have had some increase in activities November, December, we started to do a bit more work in the community in terms of ensuring that they knew the assembly points, they knew what they had to do in the event of an evacuation. We worked with the Seismic Research Center a lot over the years in the whole Volcano Awareness Week activities, and also in the community sensitization following the effusive eruption in December 2020, and where we had the alert level raised to orange. One of the key activities during the pre-eruption planning phase is really looking at resource mobilization. I don't think many persons look at it, the amount of resources that you need to really gather to manage an eruption or prepare for one. And one of the things I really want to applaud the Seismic Research Center in January for joining us here in St. Vincent. We're able to establish quite a comprehensive network. Never mind, we lost quite a few in the explosive eruption. Quite a comprehensive network that really guide us and give us the information to really effect a timely evacuation on April the 8th. And if we did not have that kind of regional collaboration and that resource mobilization, we would not have been able to effect that evacuation. Also, we must note that once La Soufrière alert level went to orange, it also triggered the regional response mechanism. Hence, CDMA was a key partner in terms of the resource mobilization. And again, we'll express thanks to CDMA and the other agencies, the government of the UK who was able to, and the French authorities who also made available helicopters that we were able to use to do some of the installation, some of the surveillance as we were leading up to the increasing activities at the La Soufrière volcano. We know this alert level well, and Dr. Joseph mentioned it too, but just to note, we have reduced back to the orange alert level on May the 6th, and we continue to monitor, and as we have more equipment being installed over the next few weeks, we will monitor and see whether that can be reduced further as we go along. Now, in part of some of the public education awareness, this was really key in the planning and the response and preparing the communities for the eruption. And this is one of the products that came out of the Volcano Ready community project led by the SRC in a collaboration with NEMO and other partners here on the ground, where we're able to identify assembly points or muster points, if you call them that, and we're able to really work through the community mapping and also identifying the vulnerable persons within the communities. And that was one of our big activity in January, February, asking the community disaster response teams to really look at the vulnerable persons in your community in the event that you have to evacuate. Do you have somewhere you're going to stay, or do you need to stay at a public shelter? And also, would you require public transportation? Because that allowed us to plan to determine how many buses we would need on either side of the island, or boats that we would need to evacuate persons. All of that happened in the pre-eruption planning stage. Now, early April, we recognized that we started having some increased activities. The week leading up to the actual explosive eruption, we started having the VTs, or the volcanic tectonic earthquakes, and the communities, especially on the volcano, really started to feel those earthquakes. And the alarm was raised, and everybody wanted to evacuate, but it wasn't quite the time yet, because we had the scientists monitoring the volcano and were informing us. But things started to change a little bit, and I clearly recall on the 8th of April, I don't know why I was not sleeping that night, but I continued to monitor the activities at the volcano. And of course, Professor Robertson chose to wake me up at 5 o'clock in the morning when I really wasn't sleeping, because I expected his call. And shortly after that, this is how things started to cascade and escalate as we went through that day. Right away, I briefed the Prime Minister at 5:45 in the morning. Then we had the cabinet briefing and press conference. And what I liked about leading up to this particular emergency, not that I really like the explosive eruption, is that we're able to always have the scientists with us when we're explaining to the public. When we had our public public releases, and when we had our press conferences, we were able to have the scientists joining us remotely, whether Dr. Joseph from Trinidad, Richie here in St. Vincent, wherever they were able to join us. So we had a press conference, and then we went straight into National Emergency Council meeting, really in preparation to really tell the agencies. I think we are getting there now. We're almost there. We need to put things in place. Lo and behold, at about 4 o'clock that afternoon, while Prime Minister was chatting and we were planning for what next, I got the call that I didn't think I would receive, hopefully not during my time at NEMO, that it's time. We think that we should consider evacuation order, and we issued the evacuation order shortly thereafter to the public. Now let's look at the response a little bit. I don't have a lot of photos. I lost my drive, most of my drive, photos from on my drive. So in the response, and we want to look at the evacuation procedures, because I think that is one of the things that we really worked hard on with the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, our local authorities, the police, the cadets, and a lot of other agencies, Coast Guard, on the ground, Red Cross, leading up to the explosive eruption. We really tightened up our sea evacuation planning with the Coast Guard, and we also tightened up our land evacuation planning. In this case, we recognize from since December, because of the effusive eruption ongoing, it was mainly towards the western side of the island. We had already made that decision in collaboration with the scientists that once there was an evacuation order given, even though communities like Chateaubilly and Fitzhugh, they were in the orange zone, we would ask those communities to evacuate simultaneously with those what we considered in the red zone, that's from Fancy come down to Georgetown. So we had a bit of a situation on the leeward side where we had a road under construction, and the bypass road, if we had attempted to do a land evacuation on the leeward side around Chateaubilly, we would have just had a bottleneck. So we already knew that we had to do a sea evacuation on the night of April the 8th, and that was done. It ran smoothly, thanks to the Coast Guard Command and his team. They set up the incident command just off the Chateaubilly wharf, and we had private ferries that really moved between the Grenadines, were able to be called out. From the time the evacuation order was given, this evacuation was taken charge by the command of the Coast Guard, and they moved those over 1,000 persons were moved from the Chateaubilly jetty into Barley Wharf. And also when the Barley Wharf was exceeded, we moved persons to Kingston and then transported them via buses to other communities that they were assigned. The windward side of the island, we had land evacuation, and that is a bit more needs a bit more logistics and planning, because from the time you give an evacuation order, it takes about 3 hours roughly before a bus can actually reach to the community. And that time in the afternoon, the buses were nowhere in the community, and as part of our planning leading up to the eruption, we had different scenarios at different times of the day what would happen, and this is one of the scenarios. Coincidentally, we tested this particular scenario the week before, around the same time that we would have given the evacuation order, and it happened just the same as the scenario. And we knew that the buses would not be in the community, and it would take a while, because what we saw from once persons started hearing about the heightened activity, we had a rush on the supermarkets, we had traffic jam, etc. So it was difficult for some of the buses to get to the communities on time. So where you would have had a bit delay on the windward side of the island, but on the leeward side of the island, it went very smoothly. Now, in terms of our response by civil authorities, the National Emergency Management Organization is really charged with coordinating the response to any major impact of hazard in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And we have a host of agencies that support us both nationally and regionally in terms of our planning and execution if there's an impact. And I'm just giving you a snapshot here from some of the agencies. What happened after the evacuation order was given? The NEOC was established right away, and we had different cells moving into the operations center. Transportation was key because we had to call in buses from different areas to transport persons. We had to activate emergency shelters. We had thousands of persons moving into the emergency shelters during that night. We had to have the agency that is going to look at maintenance, whether they had to erect more showers, looking at the toilet facilities, which is PRAGSA. And one of the things that we saw we had to do, the the overwhelming volume of calls and inquiries, it really, not that it crashed our system, it was just too much for our regular system to handle. And we had to establish a call center nearby in collaborate. Well, the chief personnel officer and the cabinet secretary really took control of that and ensured that we had a call center operating. We had personnel 24 hours then to really run that call center. And of course, once you have persons in emergency shelter, they have to look at feeding. And persons are also in the private homes who would have left with nothing, even though we would have said, months before, you need to prepare a little bit for this particular emergency. So the response is a host of agencies that would have been involved, and it would be remiss of me if I don't thank all those agencies that would have supporting us during this time. As I speak, our emergency operations center is still activated, not 24 hours, but we're there until about 9-10 in the evening, and this is going to go on for some time as we continue into the operations. Of course, we have different shifting of priorities now as we go further into managing an early recovery in terms of looking at moving persons from one emergency shelter to the next. One emergency shelter to the next as we continue. Now the impact, we knew that the volcano erupted explosively on the morning of 9th April, and while some persons may argue whether the evacuation order should have been given at 1 o'clock the day before or whether we gave it at 4 o'clock, the good thing is that we executed our evacuation plan in a timely manner. Because of our instrumentation that allowed the scientists to give us that information leading up, we're able to evacuate persons. We had no deaths and no casualty from the volcano itself, and we had a safe evacuation. And we must give credit to the science plus the evacuation planning, and the persons in the community really heed the warning and evacuated so that we didn't have any such casualties. Now, one of the things coming out of the impact that really kind of crippled us a bit, we had ashfall, I think, from about the Saturday, about 2 days. And of course, once we started having ashfall, our water system shut down. And it meant additional pressure, especially when we had, at the beginning, close to 5,000 persons in emergency shelters. We had 88 shelters activated by the Saturday. We had 88 shelters activated, and then about 24,000 persons displaced. Because what this eruption also shows us is not just the persons who are in the red and orange zones that were displaced, persons also whose housing may not have been, their roof may not have been sealed. They also were displaced somewhat. They could not stay in those homes. Because the ash just kept coming in, and they had to be counted as displaced persons also. Hence the numbers increased. But later on, when we crunch the numbers in terms of who were evacuated from the red or orange zones, we got the true picture from that. But also it did affect other persons. We know we had over 30 explosive eruptions. The last one would have been 22nd April. But of course, what some of the most devastating impacts we have seen is the pyroclastic flows and the lahars in the communities, especially in Sandy Bay. Sandy Bay has been the most impacted community that has a population. And of course, Richmond, Larakai, and Walubu, that should be Walubu, would have had a lot of pyroclastic flows and feet and feet of ash and deposits on the leeward side. So we had no access beyond Sandy Bay for almost 2 weeks. It took us about that time for us to get to Fancy and really have a good snapshot of what the impact would have been. OE and Fancy, we would have done the leeward the sea traverse, but we were not able to go in by land for about 2 weeks. And this is something we have to be guarded with going into the hurricane season or hurricane seasons, that these communities will be isolated for some time once we have the heavy rainfall of the lahars, etc. Of course, we budget. It's costing us about $1.2 million to feed persons roughly a week. It's quite large, and we would have crunched these numbers with CDEMA prior to the eruption, so we knew what it was going to take to really manage 20,000 persons in terms of feeding and support for those persons. We also had to do a supplementary budget, and we know that it has our budget and our economies have been shot during the last year with the COVID. So to have a supplementary budget with massive cleanup operations costing over $28 million is quite significant as we go forward. The impact allowed us also to before I get to the conclusion, the impact also, we saw a lot of support from our regional partners. Of course, CDMA being one of our partners to be here with us all during the pre-eruption phase to present. And we saw the response, especially from the Barbados authorities, who were some of the first to come to St. Vincent. Barbados, the World Food Programme, and other agencies were some of the first to come on the ground. And that's really was a demonstration of our regional response mechanism, how it works, and how it really worked and really came through following this this period of volcanic arrest into the full explosive eruption. So I want to, as I conclude, I just want to have a few points that we need to ponder on as we go forward. Of course, the evacuation was timely. There are no fatalities. Not to say that there are not things that we need to improve on going forward. Of course, there are always room for improvement in human systems. The impacts of the lahars will continue for a period. We saw on April the 29th in particular, we had some of the first set of lahars, heavy rainfall and lahars coming through the community of Sandy Bay in particular. We saw that again last weekend where with heavy rainfall, a tropical wave moving through, and we can expect this into the rainy season and beyond 2021. We can expect this maybe for another year or two. What is clear, though, from the impact, as we look at the impact, is that we need to look at our mapping, our development planning, our physical planning to really guide our development. Do we need to should we rebuild in those areas just like that? We recognize in the impact it might be about 36 to 50 homes that can no longer stay in the areas that they have been built previously, and we definitely have to look at relocation, the temporary housing as we go forward. As I speak, we have just over 2,600 persons remaining in the emergency shelters. We are hoping to reduce those number of shelters. We are consolidating, moving persons out of churches and out of secondary schools, because we have actually had started some education hubs continuing in terms of the children in the grade 6 and the CSEC and the Cape students returning. So we have had to move around persons a bit and have the children getting back in school. And of course, one of the big things that we don't often hear about that has been the impact, as I conclude, the livelihoods impact. Agriculture has been devastated in those communities closer to the volcano. Persons are in shelters with nothing to do. Even if they go back home, everything is gone. You have to start all over again, and there's no way you can start over right now with ash, inches of ash covering your land. So these are the things going forward. We have to look at how do we rebuild, how do we continue as communities? Do we continue to build in those areas, and how, and in terms of building our resilience, how do we go forward? So the impact has been significant on our people. We are resilient people. We continue to meet the needs of our people here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And as I conclude, I really want to thank all the regional agencies. Some of you who are here today, the SRC, CDMA, the CDR, your regional governments, and all of our government, because we would not have been able to do a massive response of meeting the needs of over 20,000 persons with all of government, all of the agencies in St. Vincent, the Red Cross, the Cadiz, every single agency and individual who would have played their part in this response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Forbes, for what was a fairly comprehensive overview of what has happened in terms of this of the civilian response. Certainly the importance of pre-planning, the importance of collaboration with the scientific group monitoring the eruption, the fact that the response required such a complex mix of groups that make up the NEOC in St. Vincent, a very complex response, and certainly ending in the impacts that you've had of the eruption, the significant impacts that have had at St. Vincent and Grenadines, certainly in terms of agriculture, in terms of ongoing impacts of lahars, in terms of the costs of cleanup, the impact on people's livelihoods, and the ongoing issues that remain. Certainly, the eruption has shown a lot about what one needs to bear in mind in terms of dealing with hazards in the region, and therefore, it is fitting that we can move now to looking at the regional response, because certainly, as Ms. Forbes indicated, the response that was required to the eruption incidents required something that was outside the the capabilities of the St. Vincent Grenadines landmass itself, and certainly the regional response has been significant. And therefore, it is fitting that we should now introduce Ms. Liz Riley, who was appointed the Executive Director of Disaster Emergency Management Organization in May 2020, but who joined SEDEMA way back in 2001 when she, soon after she was appointed as the Deputy Director in 2012, but had between 2008 and 2012 served as acting in position of Deputy Director. Ms. Riley has over 20 years experience in the area of disaster management at the regional and international level. In various capacities, as the director, she has held overall responsibility for the SEDEMA's technical programs and provided strategic guidance in the area of preparedness, as well as response, mitigation, recovery, education, training, information management. At the operational level, she has played a leadership role in the coordination of various regional responses to things like Hurricane Ivan, 2004, Haiti earthquake, Tropical Storm Erica, various hurricanes from since then. She has had field experience. It includes leadership of SEDEMA's deployment teams in response to Hurricanes Irma in 2017 and Dorian in 2019. And she currently plays a leadership role in the coordination of the region's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But not only has she been in that kind of position, but she has written, presented, and published technical papers in disaster management and environmental management whilst attached to SEDEMA. And prior to that, during her tenure at the University of West Indies and the Ministry of Physical Planning and Environment in Barbados. Liz, as I hope I can call her, has lectured in disaster management at the University of West Indies, Mona and Cave Hill. And at the international level, she had contributed to a range of technical advisory committees and is currently the vice chair of the ICG Caribbean Early Warning Systems in the region for coastal hazards. She holds a MA in Economics and Environmental and Development Studies from the University of Manchester, United Kingdom, a BSc in Geography from the University of the West Indies, and a Master's Certificate in Results-Based Monitoring and Evaluation and Information Systems from the University of Laval in Quebec. So Liz is both experienced and well qualified to look at and take us through what has been the regional response and solidarity in the context of the La Soufrière eruption 2020-21. So Ms. Riley, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richie. Good evening to everyone. And I want to say a special thanks to the University of the West Indies Seismic Research Center and the Department of Geography and Geology for inviting SEDEMA to participate, and a special good evening to my fellow panelists as well. So in the presentation this afternoon, I'll touch on 4 things to introduce those of you who may not be as familiar with SEDEMA and the Regional Response Mechanism, what we refer to as the RRM. Then I will take you through the regional response to the La Soufrière eruption. I'll touch a little bit in terms of the aspects of the work that SEDEMA will be doing with St. Vincent and the Grenadines on the recovery phases, and then to summarize by looking at some of the key considerations which impacted on this particular response effort. So SEDEMA is an agency of the Caribbean community, and we have 19 participating states, which are very geographically dispersed, as you can see on the right-hand side of the diagram. All of those territories in the yellow are SEDEMA states, so from as far west as Belize, north to Bahamas, all the way down south to the continental states of Guyana and Suriname. And it means that we have a lot of diversity in terms of the hazards that we face, as well as diversity in the types of capacity across those states. In terms of the mandate of the agency and what we're charged to do, this is outlined in our agreement establishing SEDEMA, and highlighted on the left-hand side of the screen, you will see the 5 main areas in which we operate: mobilizing and coordinating disaster relief. You'll see more on that later. We support our states in mitigating or reducing consequences of disasters. We provide comprehensive information on disasters, both in emergencies and outside of emergency times. We work through partnerships, through cooperative arrangements and mechanisms, And of course, we support our participating states to ensure that they have the adequate levels of emergency management capability. And this is done principally through our regional training center. So we also are guided by a regional strategy, and this informs all that we do. And it speaks at the higher level to building resilience in our states and encompasses a number of areas of delivery around strengthening institutions, how we utilize evidence for decision making through knowledge management, strengthening resilience at the sector level by integrating disaster risk considerations there, and of course, community resilience. And there are a number of cross-cutting themes which are captured across the base of the diagram. So an important part of the work that we do in the event of an impact to one of our impacted states is the coordination of the response. We have a coordination function similar to explained by Ms. Forbes in the role of NEMO in St. Vincent. So this is a schematic which explains our regional response mechanism, and I'll take you through it really quickly. So at the top center of the diagram, you see it speaks to the Regional Coordination Center, and this is the hub, as it were, that is operated by SEDEMA to get the whole system operating in the way that it should. And on the left-hand side, we talk about the governance arrangements, in other words, those structures and arrangements that hold the entire arrangement together. So you will notice that there are national plans, which were referred to by Ms. Forbes. We have a corresponding regional level plan, and our plans will speak to each other in terms of when we trigger actions at the regional level. We have a space to interface with our development partners, and I'll talk about how we utilize that in the response efforts. And at the bottom of the diagram, you will note that we also have what is called our sub-regional structure. I'll show you that what that looks like on the next slide. But essentially, it's a geographical zoning of our 19 participating states, looking at geographical proximity to allow us to have a more efficient response. And I'll explain to you how that worked as well. On the right-hand side of the diagram, this is an outline of the types of teams or surge support, as we call it, that we can provide to our states in the event that they're impacted and they require this type of assistance. So it can be in relief management, emergency operations support, damage assessment, rapid needs assessment, search and rescue, or we can tap into some of our other institutions to get other kinds of technical expertise as well. And you'll see how this mechanism was then applied to the St. Vincent and the Grenadines situation. So the sub-regional focal points, I mentioned this in a previous slide, and I just want to particularly zero in on the central sub-region, which is at the base, bottom right of the diagram. And this is the sub-region led by Barbados. And you would notice that St. Vincent and the Grenadines falls within the sub-region. And this will explain why Ms. Forbes had indicated about the rapid response coming out of Barbados, because they act on behalf of the system as the sub-regional focal point because of proximity to give that type of response to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And the other sub-regions in the system are mentioned here: Antigua and Barbuda, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Tobago. So before I get into the specifics of the SEDEMA actions, just to say a little bit in terms of the context that we were facing as we went into St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So we know it was a complex multi-hazard environment because COVID-19 was ongoing. You have the situation of hazards which are happening across different time scales, an ongoing volcanic eruption, COVID-19 for over 15 months. We knew there were possibilities of severe weather events, and of course we were close to the hurricane season. And what it meant is that there was a certain measure of uncertainty in terms of what we were going to be dealing with in terms of duration, and specifically with respect to COVID-19, because of the very dynamic situation with COVID-19, it meant that we really had to be very flexible in terms of how we were going to handle the response. Since the arrangements within our system, we draw personnel from states that are not impacted. So it's really a horizontal cooperation arrangement. And because of those waves and troughs that are happening throughout the region, as you're well aware, with COVID-19, it means that we really have to keep our eye on the ball with respect to which countries are going through the waves, which are going through the troughs, and therefore that helps us to understand where can we draw support from to assist the member states. So this is the situation which faced us when the effusive eruption started, and of course continued during the explosive eruption. So in terms of SEDIMA actions, let's talk about those. Coordination. So this is a critical role of the SEDIMA coordinating unit. And what does it mean? It means, how do you bring a group of well-intended participating states, as well as partners, both regional and international partners, together and organize them in such a way that it is the most effective and efficient type of support that you can provide for an impacted state. And this is a very critical role that is played by the coordinating unit. And we do so within the space of the Caribbean Development Partners Group, which I talked about a little bit earlier. And we had meetings of that group, in fact, from December of 2020, when we alerted them to the effusive eruption, and we started talking about how do we work and work better together to support St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We also established a core coordination group on volcanic hazards, and I'll show you how that fits on the next slide. And this was important because we wanted to be able to bring together the best scientific minds in the region on volcanic hazards to discuss the issues and to track what was happening with La Soufrière, but also importantly, to learn from other experiences on how best to approach the response efforts. So as a part of our information clearing function during the entire period of time, we issued 31 situation reports. They're up on our website if you want to check. And this assisted us then in bringing the whole picture together, matching the needs identified by country with the response and support that could be provided by partners. And this is a schematic here, just of the Regional Coordination Center in the middle. And all of these are cells that would have been activated once we had moved into our explosive phase. And you'll see some of this is going to come up during the conversation in terms of resource mobilization, communications, and information we talked about. Logistics, I'll talk about a little bit more, and a lot of the work is carried through by the operations cell. And here's the interface with the partners. And on this side, this is the setup of that conversation at the scientific level on the volcanic hazards. So what are some of the key things that were done? Now, Ms. Forbes mentioned the helicopter support, and this is one of the functions that SEDIMA provides in terms of resource mobilization. I'll touch on that again a little bit later. But within the core coordination group, we were able to make a presentation at the end of January on a comprehensive budget to our development partners. This was informed by budgets prepared by St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but also by the key regional agencies that were supporting. And as the country identified its needs, part of SEDIMA's role was to reach out to our development partners and try to identify resources to support that. We had good success, and we really want to thank the United Kingdom through the UK FCDO, that's the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, for coming on board really early and providing immediate resources to allow us to be able to provide the helicopter support to the SRC team. And we think that this was really game-changing because, as Ms. Forbes explained, this event was heavily driven by the science. We had to know what was happening with that volcano to be able to make the right decisions. And as you see from her presentation, the work of SRC was absolutely invaluable. In addition, I just want to go back one. Okay, thank you. So with respect to the work that the coordinating unit did since December through to April, we were integrally involved with the NEMO office and the team there, working in supporting on evacuation planning, logistics planning. We had discussions with respect to shelters, and a lot of this work was actually done remotely. And I really want to thank the coordinating unit team for the tremendous job that they did through that period of January to early April, but also to thank the national level team at Ms. Forbes and her team for being incredibly receptive and really opening minds to how we can deliver support differently. And we had 2 exercises at the end of January and at the end of March that were mentioned. And these were really important in terms of testing what do we do in particular scenarios. And that work certainly paid off. So other types of support that were provided, we provided Emergency Operations Center assistance. From the 1st of March, we had personnel on the ground, and I think this was a great decision that was made between SEDEMA and NEMO to make sure to get the operational support in early so that it was actually on the ground when the explosive phase started. And we've had personnel rotating through now. Here in the photos are 2 of the early persons on the ground, Captain Harewood and Superintendent McIntyre out of Grenada, and they did a tremendous job working with the EOC, supporting the updating of operational procedures whilst they were there on the ground and giving specific guidance. We also had other teams on the ground. We fielded a detailed damage sectoral analysis team led by Brigadier General Earl Arthurs from the Regional Security System, and we want to thank RSS for that. And this work was very important in providing St. Vincent and the Grenadines with a preliminary estimate of damage and losses from the event, fully recognizing that there was a potential for, and still is a potential for, further explosive eruptions. But what it allows is to get a snapshot of what damage and losses were at that point in time, and importantly, to point towards needs and also recommendations. And this has been picked up on and supported as a part of the early recovery process. We want to thank all the partners who supported this particular effort. Logistics was an important piece, and you saw in Ms. Forbes' presentation about the level of ash that was falling in St. Vincent. And of course, this had implications for access by air. The airport was closed. So logistics in terms of getting the teams in was really important. We worked with our security personnel out of Grenada, St. Lucia, Barbados to facilitate maritime movements. When the air cleared later, the regional security system assisted in direct movements into St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And prior to that, movement to St. Lucia and then transfer to maritime movement. So we want to thank partners for that as well. We also had fielded a high-level team. Okay, thank you. We also fielded a team with undertaking high-level meetings in country. Myself accompanied by a senior official from the Caribbean Development Bank. We visited St. Vincent quite early after the eruption, had to have discussions around how we could better shape that support for the country. We met with finance to talk through some of the financial support available, and of course, working directly with NEMO and the NEMO team on the specific areas that we were engaged in as well. Relief management, absolutely critical. Ms. Forbes touched upon the outpouring of support which came from the Caribbean region, the SEDEMA participating states and other Caribbean states, but we also had support being provided through a number of our partners, including the UN family, provided a number of the critical items on the needs list. And of course, we had to then deal with the question of how do we move these items from the areas where they're being donated into the space where it's required, which was in St. Vincent. And this is where a lot of the conversation around the logistics then took place. And specifically, I wanted to highlight the role of tropical shipping, because this is a very important partnership on the logistics side for SEDEMA. And they assisted us with the movement. It will be up to 20 container unit equivalents, 20 container unit equivalents for moving of the relief into St. Vincent. And so far, a number of countries have taken advantage of this: Antigua, Barbuda, Belize, Dominica, Grenada, Guyana, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Trinidad. And as you can see, a diversity of relief items have been moved into St. Vincent or will be moved into St. Vincent by this mechanism. And we want to recognize Tropical Shipping and the work that they did in that regard. Here's a breakdown of how we allocated per state. And this was very much based on requests from the states in terms of the quantities of the relief items that they wanted moved. And the support was there from Tropical Shipping. And what was really important is that it was well coordinated by our national disaster coordinators in each of those states. And we remained in close contact, coordinating with them to make sure that what was coming to St. Vincent was what St. Vincent asked for. So the question is then, what happens when all of this relief hits the ground? How do we organize ourselves? And the answer was really linked very closely to the CARICOM Disaster Relief Unit, which had been dispatched into country with the support of the regional security system. And they assist an impacted state in organizing themselves for reception of relief, breaking down those packages, repackaging, and distribution. And in collaboration with the World Food Programme, a logistics hub was set up at the Arnasvale Airport, which is the old airport in St. Vincent. As you know, there's a big open space, and I'll show you some additional photos of that in a moment. And so you see what happened at the hub. We had the containers come in directly from the port to the hub, unstuffing in this area. It relieved the congestion from the hub, and then inside you could see the breakdown of those packages so that you could then get them out easily to the various shelters. Of course, the CARICOM Disaster Relief Unit also assisted in the Emergency Operations Center, looking at the relief management from that side, working at the Geese Port as well. And of course, here's a photo of the Honorable Prime Minister Gonzalez with our CDRU Director, Lieutenant Colonel Jason Hills, who was out of Trinidad and the TT Defense Force. Our teams also worked on the logistics concept for St. Vincent, working with NEMO to build out a concept and a schematic as to the flows that were going to happen. So you see the incoming relief from Argyle Airport, Kingstown, coming into the relief hub, being pushed out to the shelters. And this is the model that was used then to facilitate arrangements around distribution. I want to just touch on the resource mobilization. Ms. Forbes raised it. It's an important point, and we had a very interesting experience with this event because it started, of course, as an effusive eruption, and at the end of the day, it was an eruption. And but what was interesting in the conversations at the level of development partners is what is it within their systems that would actually trigger release of funds? And as it turned out, the majority of the development partners, their triggers were actually more closely associated with the explosive phase of the eruption. But of course, there was a significant level of investment that was required for the preparedness stage. And I think this is one of the issues we'll have to examine as we do the after action review for the La Soufrière event, and certainly to pick this up in a very direct way with our development partners to see how we can perhaps help to bridge this particular matter which came up. But we want to thank the partners who provided support, whether pre or post the explosive phase. These included the UK, the Government of Canada, the European Union, UNICEF was there with us as well, USAID, as well as the government of Romania. And we want to thank all of them for their contribution to the 1.2 million US that was mobilized. So coming to the end, I just want to mention recovery, because the SEDEMA Coordinating Unit will be launching this year its Caribbean Resilient Recovery Facility. In fact, this is the first time that we have a fully established recovery function within the agency. And so under the Engender project, which is co-financed by the governments of UK and Canada and executed by UNDP, we've been able to offer St. Vincent and the Grenadines support in 4 areas for developing their national recovery framework, specific technical assistance for early recovery, assessment of critical infrastructure, and also resources to finance national interventions that can support recovery actions. And this is under active conversation now through the Ministry of Finance and Planning, which is leading the recovery efforts. So, final slide, some of those considerations for during the event and also post-event. One is about really reiterating this message about resilience and the reality of the multi-hazard environment where we live. And I think this event has underscored that in a way that many events maybe were not able to. And this is a critical message, I think, coming forward. We are now, of course, 9 days into the hurricane season and predicted to be an active hurricane season with 18 named storms, 8 of which are anticipated to become hurricanes and 4 of which are expected to be major storms. That's the prediction by the Colorado State University, and we're navigating it in a COVID-19 context. So all of those complexities that I raised with you around where do we source personnel for deployment, when they come into country, how long do they have to quarantine? Do they have to quarantine? Can we have a different arrangement, such as what St. Vincent and the Grenadines put in place initially, which was called a working quarantine? And all of these are questions that we have to navigate as we go through this season and as we continue in the COVID times. Varying timescales of the events and the uncertainty of duration. We still have an ongoing humanitarian situation in St. Vincent, and the duration of that is unknown, and that has to be managed. The needs are changing over time, and our systems have to be responsive to this. I want to really emphasize the partnership and collaboration, and I want to thank our regional institutions who I think have been absolutely tremendous, demonstrating the real essential value that they bring to the regional arrangements and to the regional response mechanism. And I want to single out the really excellent work that was done by the Seismic Research Center. You know, we were never there were never any gaps in terms of our understanding of what was happening with the event. And this is absolutely essential for an agency like SEDEMA, which has to deal with coordination because we must base it on the science. Flexibility and agility, absolutely critical, because in the COVID times, we do have to make sure we're able to, yes, the plans are there, but we have to be flexible to be able to respond to what we're seeing on any given day at any given time. And that flexibility and agility, I think, is the hallmark of how we're operating at the national and the regional level now. And of course, just to emphasize the importance of the recovery phase, because St. Vincent and the Grenadines will require support from us as a region through the recovery phase. And I just want to indicate here, as we've stated to the Prime Minister, that we are fully committed to supporting St. Vincent and the Grenadines through this process. So with that, I want to thank you again for the opportunity to present, and happy to take any questions after.
Thank you very much, Liz. And as expected, a very comprehensive and thought-provoking presentation, certainly taking us through the whole conceptual framework in terms of how the regional response mechanism operates, you know, issues of coordination, search support, logistics, relief management, all those issues that had to be dealt with in the context of what evolved in St. Vincent. There's one particular aspect which I trust that we'll get back to, the whole question of resource mobilization and what triggers that kind of response. I must tell you that that is an issue that has seen its head risen in the 1971-72 eruption in 1979. So it's an ongoing thing. When do we respond? And is it the explosive phase of the diffusive phase? How much you put into the pre-response? And certainly you left us with quite a few considerations, some issues of resilience. How do you deal with resilience in a multi-hazard environment? Issues of hurricane and COVID, just like the volcano and COVID, and other issues, like lots of things to think about. That said, we will move on now to our next and final presenter, and fittingly, it would be to someone who would speak to us about lessons and, you know, what lessons we can take from this. And you know, it's quite fitting that we now should move to Dr. Roseanne Smith, who is a Vincentian lecturer at the Department of Geography and Geology at the University of West Indies, Mona. She lectures there on several courses, including disaster risk management, She has broad areas of research interest, which includes disaster risk reduction, climate change, adaptation, sustainable livelihoods. And in fact, her research area has examined certainly social risk vulnerability as it is exacerbated by disaster risk, including climate risk, across all social groups. And in fact, she has done quite a bit of research on St. Vincent, particularly on the northern parts of St. Vincent, some of the same communities that have been affected by this eruption. So I must say, Dr. Rose Smith, you are particularly well placed to take us through as the final presenter and looking at resilience issues and lessons that we can learn from the ongoing eruption that has happened in Soufrière. So over to you, Dr. Smith.
Thank you so much, Prof. Robertson. I almost said Prof. Richie. I've heard your name so much on social media and just looking at, UB Seismic Center videos and so on. I want to thank everyone for organizing the conference about the panel discussion and for having me. I am a proud Vincentian from the Maraqua Valley, the Green Zone, and I take pleasure in giving this presentation because of where I'm going with it. It's about lessons learned. And we have been talking about us being a resilient people. And so we really want to examine what it is resilience is and are we moving towards resilience. This map has come up a lot. It has a vulnerability map. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I want to speak today about two things really. I want to look at the island's vulnerability by just going through a few photos. And then I want to speak a little bit about resilience and the way forward, looking at things from a very micro scale, examining what some of my preliminary research, what has been coming out on social media, what has been coming through the voices of the people. And so it's very micro scale in a sense. And so we know the volcanic erupted and the impact was devastating. The impact to infrastructure was devastating. And this is just a few photos showing the impact to housing. The picture on the left is Sandy Bay. And you can see schools. And you notice a lot of it has to do with the ashfall and the roof. Then we also see the impact on agriculture. And this was significant because agriculture itself is the backbone of our economy. And the red zone, a lot of the persons living there are heavily reliant on agriculture. So even as we think about it as a backbone of our economy, we have to think about that where we have entire households who are reliant on agriculture. So if agriculture is destroyed, the question is, what is there? What is next? What is there for them? And so I share two pictures in terms of the livestock that remain in the red zone because we want to talk a little bit about the lessons there, and also the agriculture in terms of the crops themselves. Did any crop survive during the damage assessment? Is there any lesson to be learned there moving forward? I could also speak a little bit about the psychosocial impacts, but given time and so on, there are so many lessons to be learned here. And it is great in a sense that we got an opportunity to look at our plans, revisit our plans, because as much as you will put what you will believe is a solid plan in place, you never really know whether it's a good plan until it's tested. And what the volcanic eruption would have done is given us a chance to test our plan and to see, where our strengths are and where our weaknesses are and how we can move forward. So I want to start by giving us a definition from the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction of resilience. We have been hearing that term and we use it. I myself use it very loosely because we love to say, as Vincentians, we are a resilient people and we are going to rise from the ash and we are going to bounce back. And yes, we will. But as we get into really looking at how to be resilient, we must examine the definition. And it's at this place we start to think about what are the indicators of a resilient society in light of disaster risk reduction. And so we see the United Nations Office is speaking about the capacity of a system, a community, a society, or even households. And they say to adapt, to resist, and to change in order to reach an acceptable level of functioning. So our questions, we have to ask ourselves at this moment is, how are we adapting? What does it take for us to resist? And what do we need to change? So I'm going to move forward now by looking at some observations that I would have gathered, as I said, in preliminary research, and then looking at the way forward. And one of the things I want to speak about is the communication. At the initial stage, and this is prior to the explosive eruption, there was a lot of conversation on social media, even as the information was being shared. Persons were speaking about the language being too technical, and it changed over time. We see great attempts to break down that language, but we realize that the struggle was real. Persons were asking, so does that mean it's going to erupt? What does that mean? We also talk about the mediums of communication. What mediums were we using, or what were the plans? And even as we spoke about using all the mediums, when the evacuation order was issued, there was a sort of absence of that blast message that we were expecting from Digicel and Flow and so on. And then the whole idea of vulnerable groups like the disabled, we factoring these people into the communication plans, because even as we look at the different programs that were shared through social media and so on, we did not see someone doing sign language. So we have to really think about that. And then there's the whole comment coming out about the transparency in the communication. And so in thinking about the way forward, we really have to start thinking about establishing a robust multi-hazard communication plan. And for that, we definitely have to tap into our risk communication specialists, where it speaks about getting persons on board who are trained. And I like to say, I know we tend to ask for consultants, and we bring in consultants, but it's really good during this period of research to find out that we actually have persons in St. Vincent. I know of at least one person with a master in risk communication. So we really have to start thinking about developing such a plan. And this plan must consider the voice of the disabled. We also have to recognize the importance of social media, and I'm quite certain recognize it because a lot of the information I have gathered was through social media, but not simply in terms of just streaming videos and so on, but in terms of a greater role in managing, for example, that the NEMO page, constantly there were updates coming in, there were pictures coming in and so on, but there was a case where you really, in terms of questions coming from the public and so on, there were complaints there in terms of getting those addressed. Can we use social media to really address questions that the public may have? I also want to speak about the sectoral impacts of the volcanic eruption and what are the lessons we have learned there. We have seen the impacts of the eruption on livestock, and we have seen it on domesticated animals. It was really hard rendering, for example, to see that. And, we saw animals in need of food, in need of water. And we know that human lives would have been the priority, but at the same time, we have to think also a little bit broader. Several persons who remained in the red zone, for example, admitted that they stayed to protect their livelihood. And that is, it might seem, I don't know if to say weird or why would you stay to protect your livelihood, but there are so much lessons to learn there. What they think they can do or their lack of knowledge in terms of the eruption itself and the impact it can have, but it also speaks about their connection to land and how significant the livestock is for them. There were questions coming out surrounding whether an agriculture plan existed, or if there is one, whether it was approved prior to the eruption, because we saw the livestock were still in the red zone, and we want to know, what was the plan for that. So one of the way forward is to consider mainstreaming disaster risk management in every ministry, and where that has already been happening, to sort of strengthen it. We want the development and approval of hazard-specific plans for each sector. For the agriculture sector, which is very, very, very significant, while human lives are important and is a priority, we also know about the indirect impacts of volcanic eruption, for example, through famine. If there is no food, food security is integral. It is a must. So one of the things that came to mind is whether we can develop a system for tagging and tracking animals so that they can, or they could have been safely removed, or in the future we can safely remove them to the green zone. And this system can allow for tracing these animals following any disaster and returning these animals to the farmers. And so it would not really clash with the movement of people, because we would have to do that prior to the eruption. So that is something going forward that might need consideration. The other important sector, and it was mentioned, was the water sector. We saw the impacts and the implications of the impact, right? One of the things that occurred was actually one of the truck that was carrying water. Persons actually tried to steal bottled water when the truck stopped. I'm not certain if it was to just give some water. And one of the things I would have learned even in distribution of resources is, once there is a central hub, persons should be advised to not to stop on the way, but and to take it to that distribution point. But even as we think about that, the lessons are there in terms of what water security and security in the traditional form of the sense of the word, in terms of policing and military in other countries, other islands, for example, in light of climate change and the crisis in relation to water. We see that civil unrest, and in a very small way, when we saw the whole issue coming out about the stealing of the water and so on, in a way it shows us the implications if that situation was to go on for a little bit longer. So we really have to be thinking about water security. One of the coping mechanisms that came out was the whole using of these natural springs, and it was amazing the amount of springs that we see existed on the island. And so we know that that is in progress. That's a picture of one of our past students from the Department of Geography and Geology doing some mapping of the local springs, and we are hoping to move that not just simply as a coping mechanism, but a blueprint for adaptation, especially in light of climate change. It's we can think about checking the quality of the water, and we can see how much we can this can be a bottom-up, real community-driven strategy, because as it is, there is just like a little what we call a spouting collecting the water, but we can see how the community efforts themselves can come together to really secure that place. And I think that is was a very, very important point coming out of the volcanic eruption. Another point coming out was the whole idea of how necessary it is to have water tanks for your homes. But the whole question of availability and even more affordability came to the forefront. What can we put in place to address, for example, affordability? Right, I know in Jamaica here there is a national housing trust, and I know that there are systems in place. For example, if you want to have a water tank, you get it at a very low interest rate, and so we have to start thinking about how we can put system in place. I know for the public sector that some part of your salary is pulled towards that national housing trust, but it helps us in the long run, especially the poor people, because when you compare the interest rate for mortgage to that of the housing trust, it's very, very low. And so we have to think about how we can, have a greater uptake of households having these water tanks. What can we do in terms of working with the financial institutions to allow for uptake of water tanks? I know currently this session is going on, but even right now there's a session going on my next point, which is ecosystems restoration in light of climate change. So the volcanic hazards would have destroyed vegetation, and we know the important role of those ecosystem and the ecosystem services provided by different things like the forest and so on. So we have to start again thinking about an ecosystem restoration plan, and I like to say drive by the community, because I'm one of those advocates for community-based disaster risk management. Even for the health sector, and this has been touched on I believe in Liz's presentation, the whole idea that we were operating in a really multi-hazard. We always use that multi-hazard environment, but St. Vincent and the Grenadines was a prime example. We have the volcanic eruption, then there was the COVID pandemic, the dengue epidemic, and even following the volcanic eruption, we saw when we asked for rain, we got rain, and we got so much rain, we saw the impact of that rain, right? And observations again show us that even as we look at how persons were dealing with the COVID pandemic, and this is some challenges that are currently going on in terms of the wearing of the mask, the following of the protocols, understanding the health and the long-term implications of the ash, walking through the ash and so on. It means that we really have to not simply revisit or create a multi-hazard plan for the health sector, but we really have to see how we can address education and other things that I will look at in a little while. So again, I mentioned the whole idea of community-based organizations and the fact that I am an advocate for community-based organization. And I was happy to see in Michelle's presentation, Fancy, my daring community. Fancy is one of those communities from way back when I was doing my PhD research with an active community-based organization group with the help of NEMO and the Red Cross, and it's one of those communities that really we can use as an example to other communities in terms of how a community-based organization should work. Oftentimes, we find that we have a few of these groups, and they see themselves as responders. And we have to move beyond that vision where they're seeing themselves as respondents, and see themselves more in terms of preparedness and mitigation. One of the challenges that we have seen coming out of the volcanic eruption and any hazard is oftentimes we are limited. We are limited in terms of our financial resources. We are limited in terms of our technical expertise. And there is project funding and in several other countries, there at times there are calls. So it's time for us to really see how we can strengthen and develop new community-based organization groups. It's also, we need to train these groups, not only in terms of the preparedness, mitigation, response, and so on, but in terms of project writing and grant writing. Because if we are thinking about moving towards resilience, we have to think about having the community not only recognizing that these are vulnerable areas or recognizing that these are these are our vulnerabilities, but also be an active part in terms of addressing it by, they themselves writing for these grants to build back stronger. Again, we notice our strong social capital, and it has been said in several of the presentations how we work together at the regional level, how we work together, how we, the international community came together and supported us. But one of the things we also see was our local responders. The first responders were our locals. There were a lot of volunteers who were not a part of the official list, you did not need to ask. They just came at the forefront. We see the diasporic connection, I myself in the diaspora, and we see how persons work together in the diaspora to sort of strengthen and to pull their weight and strengthen relief efforts and recovery efforts. Can we capitalize on that energy while it exists? Because we know over time persons tend to forget, right? Is it a case where we can have them work with different community groups, encourage them to become a part of community groups and take it from there? So those are some conversations we want to have. Another important conversation is the whole idea of mitigation. I say mitigation or relocation, because one of the things coming up a lot in terms of discussion is whether persons should be permanently relocated from the red zones. And there are different opinions coming out of that. And I have one here I pull out on social media because this person actually come from the red zone, and she said it's been a month since we have been living out of the red zone, and while I cannot speak for everyone, I know my area people can't wait to go back home. After all, home is home. Nowhere else is more comfortable. And having worked in the communities, for example, in that northeastern side, I know that there's a real closeness between the members, right? So the home in itself, there's a attachment to place, there's an attachment to land. And so going forward, we have to see how much we can integrate the voices and involve these people in the discussion on relocation. Is permanent relocation an option? And if not, should we be considering internal relocation? Should we be mapping? And I think I saw that coming out again in the presentation, the whole idea of mapping. But mapping and zoning the communities, because we know that there are some parcels, some houses that are right along close to riverbeds, they are along the coast, and they are in these high risk zones within the communities themselves. So if persons should move back, then there possibly need to be some relocation efforts within the community by moving them out. But even if they are still there, the community are still very much high risk. So what is in building codes, right? The ash itself would have destroyed roofs, right? And that is where the greatest impact was in terms of the ash. So we have to think about new building codes possibly, or enforcing of building codes. But how do we do this in light of the poverty, right? In light of the poverty that exists in the communities? Is it enough to say, let us enforce building codes, right? How will they be enforcing the building codes? Because persons put up little houses just so that they would not be homeless, right? So how can we support that effort in light of poverty? The other thing we have to be doing is there is a very, very low uptake in terms of insurance, whether it's life, health, or peril insurance, generally in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And when I did my research way back a few years ago in those northeastern, persons were not taking out peril insurance and all these things for different reasons. But part of it, again, has to do with income. Not having money, not trusting in insurance, not understanding insurance. So what can we do now? What systems can we put in place for a greater uptake of insurance? Because moving forward, we have to think about life, health, and peril insurance, because they are all connected in one way or the other in terms of disasters, risk management. Right on the whole idea of mitigation. So I spoke briefly about structural mitigation in terms of rebuilding back and building back better should we remain. Even whatever zone you have to think about in terms of the ashfall, where that it has caused tremendous impact. How do you build? But in terms of education and public awareness, a lot of things would have happened. A lot of, we have seen from the UE Seismic presentation what they would have done. We know that NEMO would have kept volcanic week yearly and so on. But is a volcanic week enough? Because one of the issues we have is the culture of our people, and we have a culture of reacting. We saw that persons ignore evacuation orders, and we saw that persons remained, and I have that little picture there because several times Coast Guard had to risk their lives to go and pull people out of the red zone when they realized that it's worse than they would have thought. Persons did not only stay in those zones simply because they wanted to protect their livelihood, but some actually wanted to experience. They have never experienced a volcanic eruption. And so we heard those things coming out. And we know risk perception is an important part of disaster risk management. So going forward, we have to think about mainstreaming disaster risk management in schools curricula. Throughout the Caribbean, I believe it's time enough. We have a wealth of information from varying hazards, not just volcanoes, but also hurricane. And this particular eruption has given us enough videos, enough articles and enough pictures, information to develop resources, not only for primary and secondary, but tertiary level. We want to reach to a place where we see CXC questions or CXC exams having disaster risk, not simply as one or two multiple choice, but an area, for students, whether it's optional or so on. So we really have to think about that. I put mandatory evacuation because, if we are thinking about mandatory, there are legislation and policy implications for that. But if possibly if we can change our culture of reacting, right, it's quite possible that we can achieve the same thing moving forward with the information. So mainstreaming disaster risk management in schools curricula, I know things have been happening. I know we are moving through towards that. So I'm very extremely happy to see that steps taking place for that. And then I want to touch on poverty eradication. As much as I have highlighted all these different things, one of the number one thing, it's number one in the sustainable goals that we have to address is the poverty. So we have heard about extreme poverty in the high risk areas. We have seen the heavily dependency on agriculture, which is a very sensitive sector. So what we have to do is actually aim towards eradicating poverty. We have heard time and time again, and oftentimes we will have these where persons have to move. We say you have to evacuate, and you will say you have to carry 3 days of food. The reality is there are households with not even 1 day of food. So that is something we have to think about. We have to think about implementing national appropriate, and this is coming from the Sustainable Development Goals, social protection systems, and these systems have to be sustainable, right? So it's not one-off, because the whole idea surrounding social protection systems, there's supposed to be some form of transformative change. You're supposed to be some sort of change, so that you are not moving back to the same position. We are actually moving persons out of poverty to address disaster risk. And so everything that you see is linked to poverty. And so we have to think about strategies now to reduce the poverty levels in those areas. And my final point I want to address is governance. Governance is always an issue. And I do not want us to think about governance here in terms of, oh, this is not doing, that is not doing, because again, disaster risk management and the whole idea of the volcanic eruption involves a lot of persons. So there would be a case where persons know that this is your role, but they go away from actually what they were charged to do. So the whole idea of the principles of governance, the transparency, the accountability, equitable and inclusiveness, and responsiveness. I note, I read an article just this morning which speak about scientists waiting for permit to install volcanic equipment. And I listened to the PM saying, we cannot have this bureaucracy in a time like this. It needs to happen. And so he was investigating. So when we talk about good governance and the principles of good governance, I also want to speak about research. We have to assess the extent to which these principles were achieved and which are the areas that we need to strengthen. We have to be able to capture the voice of the poor and the vulnerable, because one of the things coming out from the UNDP, they say ensuring that the voices of the poorest and vulnerable are heard in decisions about the allocation of resources affecting them. And so they would have been speaking a lot about social media, very wary in terms of some of the things that they may not have understood how it works, and wary of the time because they do not understand certain things, right? We know that St. Vincent, for example, has a certain political environment, and we have seen how the political affiliation would have affected certain things. So how has political affiliation impacted the disaster risk management process? That is another question that we can investigate and think about what we are learning from that, how we can address different areas, how we can strengthen our allocation and distribution systems. Now, that this is not an easy thing. Regardless of how much systems we put in place, it will always need some form of strengthening, because there are always lessons to be learned. As I said, once a hazard hit, we get a chance to see things. I want to also think about, even as we think about governance and good governance and how administration comes into that. The whole idea of creating a database to capture the skill set of our graduates. and repositioning some persons who are trained in critical areas. So when I've learned, for example, of persons home, because one thing as Vincent, we pride ourselves in, as much as we are happy people, a happy bunch of people and so on, we are a highly intelligent bunch of people. And I've seen such solid ideas coming from the voices of Vincentians themselves. And then when you investigate their position, I am seeing persons, for example, we have a person with master in risk communication. We have seen the issue with risk communication, but they are in teaching. So we really have to create a database where we capture our skill sets, of our graduates when they go and study, and we can see how we can reposition them throughout the ministries, especially if we are mainstreaming disaster risk management in various ministries. We really want to reposition persons there who can do the job, and who might need extra training, ongoing training, and so on. So there are a number of lessons. I have not touched all of the lessons that we have learned. There are so many lessons. As you see, we see persons already going into volcanic ash soap, using the ash, and that is another lesson. What can we use the ash for? But at the end of the day, I am going to use the word resilience very loosely and in its very true sense. Vincentians are a really resilient set of people. We have a lot of lessons, and it's an ongoing process. It will take some time for us to get back to not only normalcy, but in terms of really transforming ourselves. But I believe that the climate it's ripe enough, to really capitalize on the skill set and the strengths that we have seen coming out at this very moment. So I want to thank the organizers for having me, for being a part of this panel, and the research continues, because I believe that the institutional analysis is important, as well as the community level, household level analysis, because there's so much things to learn, and even as we think about moving forward. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much, Dr. Smith. We are a bit over, and we have quite a few questions. So I'll just quickly summarize to a certain extent that certainly a lot of what you've spoken about is certainly things to take forward, and we can certainly explore. I know from my own experience that some of them, there's work going on and ongoing in some of those areas, certainly in terms of community-based organizations, in terms of looking at sectoral impacts and water supply and various things like that. But unfortunately, I want us to be able to at least deal with perhaps 3 of the questions, of the many questions we have. And I'd encourage people to still put their questions, and certainly from a UE seismic perspective, we'll try to see if we could get some of them addressed, even if we don't do them on this occasion in terms of the live program. So my first question I'd address to Dr. Joseph. I'll have one for Dr. Joseph, and then I'll have one for Ms. Forbes, and then I'll have one for sort of Ms. Riley and sort of more general everyone to a certain extent. So in terms of Dr. Joseph, there's a question in terms of the chances, and I'll try to integrate. There's about 3 or 4 questions, but I'll try to sort of, a lot of them relate to the same kind of thing. The questionnaire is asking what's the chance of the volcano going explosive as it did in April, and the question of whether or not you saw any precursory signs of it going explosive, and certainly if you're likely to see it in the future, given what we have. And if you could address that, and in terms of what kinds of things we'd expect if that happens, that'll be the first question coming from one of the online persons.
So to answer that question, we have a different situation with respect to I don't want to say precursor, but remember now, before we were dealing with a dome in the crater. Now we don't have a dome. We have a vent that is where the source of the magma and the explosions would have taken place from. So we are looking for changes in seismicity and ground, particularly seismicity, as well as the gas and the ground affirmation signals to tell us what could be happening in terms of going forward. With respect to another explosion, the volcano becoming explosive, again, we expect to see different precursory signals, but the first of which would most likely be the restart of VT activity. This would indicate a fresh batch of magma moving up. And then because we now have that more open system, we will see an increase in the SO2 degassing. So there would be, and of course, the ground deformation changes. So we will see signals of that happening. But I know, Richie, that this is a volcano that you've studied intensely. And in terms of the way in which it behaves, you could probably also add in terms of the type of behavior that provide some information based on the type of behavior that La Soufrière has seen in the past. Has certainly been something more discrete in terms of explosion happening, and then things slowly return at a background level. I'm not saying that this is what will happen, but this is the typical pattern here. But of course, if that is to change, we are monitoring over time to see if an eruption could restart, explosive eruption could restart. I hope that I answered that question, and maybe.
Certainly, and I don't want to take up any time and sort of respond to any of those. So I'll leave it there and go on to a question. There are a couple of questions that Ms. Forbes could handle, but I think there's one particularly I think that might be quite interesting to hear your perspective. And this relates to your reflections in terms of looking back at the event. What do you think are two aspects of the eruption, or the so much the eruption, but the whole event and management of it that you think worked or successfully worked? What are, maybe the person asked about two aspects, but I think what are aspects of it that you think work? And secondly, what are some of the aspects that you think that are in urgent need of improvement going forward? What worked? Some of the two things at least that worked, and two things that you think that needs urgent improvement. Over to Ms. Forbes.
Okay, thanks, Richie. What worked? There were two extremes in terms of the evacuation process, and I think we really have to examine the community makeup. What worked on the leeward side in particular, we saw the community disaster organizations really pull together and execute their evacuation planning. And this was so through the work that we would have done over the years. We heard talk about community-based organizations. These things have been ongoing in St. Vincent for quite a bit of time. Some groups are stronger than others. And the way the North Leeward in particular, District Disaster Group, worked with NEMO and the other organizations and really executed the evacuation planning via the sea, that really worked. And that really came through years of working with that community and also having strong leaders within that community who really understood their role and have been involved for quite some time in what work. What work is a science. We need to be guided by science and in these instances. And I think the whole idea of developing the network and creating that citizen science partnership over the years really allowed us to effectively communicate the information to the public in terms of when it was time for you to get out of the community in terms of that. Now, improvements, what we are seeing, we had a structure, and it has worked for some time, but we saw that a big event like this, and a large event like this, where it's the biggest event we have had in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in terms of, in recent times, at least in our current lifetime, managed event, that we need to relook our structures, we need to relook our systems, we need to relook the organization's roles and responsibilities within the system. I know one of the presenters talk about mainstreaming disaster management across all sectors. It's something that we have been pushing for over a decade, but yet it has not been happening. We need to really relook how we position disaster risk management throughout the entire nation, not just the civil service, because it's all of society approach. So that's one. What I think we need to look at also is a resource mobilization for disaster risk management. I think one of my disappointment leading up to this particular explosive eruption is that many persons thought that the La Soufrière would stay effusive for a long time. Nobody thought it would, and it would go explosive. So it was difficult for us to have persons understanding that vision, understanding that preparedness. Why were we taking it seriously? Because they thought, okay, it would be like a 1971-72 event and not go explosive for another 7 years or so. But and it was difficult to mobilize resources because many persons did not recognize it as an emergency, which was sad. It was already erupting effusively, but many persons did not see it as an actual emergency. And that is one of the downside. We need to look at each event as a separate event, even though and each event it will not necessarily be the same. 1971, 72, 1979 versus 2020, 21 versus 1902. Every event is different.
Thank you very much. And if my final question, perhaps, if I actually have another one in case we have time, but this one goes to Ms. Riley. It could perhaps be one that could be addressed by Ms. Forbes too, but I think I would like you, Liz, to address it in the context of sort of the regional agency. And this speaks to the fact that do we need to address the legal or regulatory framework to deal with emergency communications? The whole question of if you, or maybe it already exists, if you need to get information out, is there a framework legally that a regulatory framework that allows the disaster agencies to get emergency messages out rapidly? So is that in the broadcast license for the institutes that operate broadcast stations in the region? I don't know, you would know a lot about the agency, the legal framework in the region in terms of emergency broadcast. I don't know if you could address that.
Thanks, Richie, and thanks so much for the question. It's a very interesting question. So the Model Comprehensive Disaster Management legislation that has been prepared by SEDEMA does contain specific language with respect to messaging to populations and that interface with the telecommunications sector to ensure that authoritative messages from credible institutions get out. Now, in terms of speaking from the lens of what individual states have in place, I can't speak to that specifically. But what I can tell you is that in revising the legislation a few years ago, this was one of the areas that we had discussed with our participating states. And in fact, the participating states had flagged it as a specific component that needed to be spoken to not only within the bill, but also within the regulations. And it is treated under the umbrella of the early warning systems because the communication of the message is one of those 4 components of end-to-end people-centered early warning systems. So I hope that assists a bit to find out about the national level. I think we have to delve specifically into national level legislation to see what exactly is there, but the model bill does speak to it.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. I'm not sure if I think we are almost out of time. I'll just leave, if I can. Yeah, we can take, right, good. So let's move then over to Dr. Smith. It's more a comment and for a reflection. You've given us lots of ideas about things that certainly we need to think about going forward, from lessons going forward. I'd like you to speak to one challenge that we had during this eruption, and you've had in past events like this, is that the response, as Liz said, there is a certain amount of latency in terms of resource mobilization. Often the response to an emergency is triggered when an event happens, and because you had the build-up being an effusive eruption, the event in the perception of some had not happened. And therefore, in the context of going forward, what do you think we need to do in terms of getting the response that is required in events that may have a very slow onset and something big hasn't happened? Do you think, for example, having community-based organizations and having a response at the local level, what kinds of things can you reflect on that might help in terms of getting that response, that resource mobilization more rapid in slow onset events? Let's, Rosemary? As to you.
In terms of that's a good question in terms of a challenge that we face, and I would say across the Caribbean we are a very reactive people, and that is why I call for the mainstreaming of disaster in disaster risk management into schools curricula, because I really believe that we have to, it's a cultural issue, you know. It's almost who we are, and if we are going to change culture, we really have to be bombarding people with information. So we are saying we have in the volcanic week, and we do have a volcanic week, and I'm quite certain that if you ask, you might see the same faces always coming to the volcanic week activities, and they are the persons who would have moved first. You know, who we need to be tapping into are those persons who don't actually come out, right? Who don't support the process, and those persons who do not have access and to the information. So that is why I'm saying we really have to change, start with the very young. This is a long-term change, right? If an eruption should happen in, God forbid, in the next 2 weeks, you might find everybody move because it's fresh in the mind. But give them a year, give them a 2 week, forget. What we want to do is find a way of keeping this thing fresh, keeping this information fresh. And I am seeing we have a national TV station, and we need to have a 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock or whatever, where we always have some sort of disaster management program. Disaster risk management has to become a part of us so that the information is always there, you know. So every morning we say we have this person with their talk program and so on, but do we have a 1 hour slot, you know, every day, where we can say this is, you know, disaster risk, where we can invite community groups to say this is your week to control the program, to present, right? Because this is a collaborative effort, it's a cultural change effort, and so it's not a one-off thing to say, you know, do this and it will fix. It's actually about changing culture. And to change culture, it means that we have to be educating people daily from primary, and hopefully as they go into secondary, this information will become so much a part of them that when they hear move, they will move. And I hope I was able to address it, you know, in some way or the other.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And thanks very much to all the panelists. I think we'll wrap up here. I know that there are some people who have asked questions in the chat, and I can assure you we would look back at them and try to get them answered. Certainly, if you have any volcanological questions, anything to do with the volcanology, I would commit to personally going in and responding and making sure that you get a response. I'd like to thank all the panelists. I think we certainly have a lot to think about. We have gotten a good overview of what has happened in terms of this eruption. We have gotten a very good insight into what the crisis response was. And we certainly see that in terms of volcanic eruptions and the multi-hazard environment in which we exist in the region, we need to look at it in a regional perspective. And that certainly there are lots of lessons going forward. There's lots of lessons that this can give to St. Vincent and Grenadines, but wider regionally, it can tell us a lot about what we need to do in terms of putting our acts in order so that we can be better placed to respond to and to live with hazards that we have to live with, like volcanoes. So I'd just like to turn you over now to Ms. Dr. Edwards, who will give the vote of thanks. And again, encourage you, if you have any questions, keep the questions going. We'd respond to them in the chat as time goes on. And we look forward and to further discussions. And we thank the faculty and the Department of Geography and Geology for helping us, reaching out to us and helping us from a seismic perspective to get involved in this activity.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and what an afternoon it has been. And so it is for me to thank all of you who have made the journey with us, where we moved from science through to governance and institutional arrangements. And I certainly learned a lot about the complexity of disaster response at the national level, the regional level, the challenges that we face with response, just the whole coordination. And of course, we moved on to our final presenter, who looked so much at the social and cultural mores and the reality of resilience and how do we address resilience through research. So it has been a very full afternoon. And Of course, such an event would not be possible without many persons and organizations who it is upon me to thank for their role. We were ably moderated by Professor Richard Robertson, and we thank him for moving us through the proceedings, and of course, the food for thought that we had provided by Dr. Joseph, Dr. Smith, Ms. Forbes, and Ms. Riley. This event was hosted by the Department of Geography and Geology, whose head, Dr. Donovan Campbell, was an early conceptualizer about this discussion, along with the UE Seismic Research Center. From UE Seismic, I would like to acknowledge Ms. Alia Juman and Stacey Edwards and all the other staff members who supported them in making this event possible. We'd like to acknowledge the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, the National Emergency Management Organization of St. Vincent, and the Dean's Office for the Faculty of Science and Technology at the Mona campus. Our Dean, Professor Michael Taylor, was very supportive of the event. And within the faculty office, I'd also like to acknowledge Mrs. Terry Ann Collins Frey, our secret weapon and Swiss Army knife, who did so much to make this event come together. We'd also like to acknowledge Miss Claudia Lewis, who provided the wonderful graphics for the poster and the screen holder that you would have seen at the start of the broadcast. And most of all, because we are using their platform and because of the meticulous attention that they paid to detail for sound, video, and all aspects of quality, I would like to thank the UETV team led by Jeanette Carew and our technical leads, Maxi Baldeo and Mistral Baldeo. Also supported by Jemani Dunn. So the UETV team were just fabulous with the attention to detail and the support that they provided to us as we worked through the technical challenges of putting persons together from across the region for a broadcast. Of course, this is a part of the Science Today Fora, and so we acknowledge Dr. Andre Coy, who is the Faculty of Science and Technology Associate Dean for Outreach, who also lent his support to this evening's event. And of course, with all of those persons and organizations, there would have been no event without you, the audience. And so we'd like to acknowledge all the persons who joined us, whether by UETV, through YouTube, or any other platforms, for this afternoon's event. And it is upon me to just say thank you to all and to have a good evening.